The cloud data centers are very important to us, and when we look at it, we had good adoption in the first generation of EPYC with Naples, including Microsoft Azure and Amazon and Baidu and Tencent. I think what we see in the second generation of EPYC as it relates to both cloud and OEM is for those customers who were originally involved in the first generation of Naples, they're actually doubling down and they're increasing the number of instances. You heard from HP Enterprise yesterday that they're tripling, their portfolio. And then for some of the newer names, like for example, we're very proud of Google and their announcement. I think Google is just a marquee environment for let's call it tough data center problems. And so to be able to be a part of that is a real honor for us. And what you heard from Google is, they have us in their production environments for internal workloads, as well as plans for Google, Cloud Platform later on in the year. We're also very excited about the announcement with Twitter. Again, that's let's call it an internal platform as it relates to, cloud environments. And I think we have both. So to your question of internal versus external, we have the external facing instances that you heard of from Microsoft Azure. And then we have, some of the internal stuff that you've heard from Google and Twitter.
Along similar lines, given that the cloud giants tend to be faster when it comes to adopting new silicon than like traditional enterprises, what portion of AMD's RAM sales do you expect, like in the next, say, 2 or 3 quarters, to come from the cloud giants relative to the enterprise clients?
I think the 2 largest segments for us over the next, let's call it a couple of quarters to the end of the year will be cloud. And that's cloud, sort of the tier 1, sort of the Super 7, as well as some of the next wave of cloud companies, as well as HPC. We've done very, very well with HPC, a number of wins with a number of OEMs, and these tend to ramp faster because they're highly technical in their decision making, and once they make the decision, they move quickly. Enterprise tends to take a little bit longer. Fortune 1000 CIOs take a bit longer in their evaluation cycle. We love the platform that we have. If you look across HPE, Dell, Lenovo, Supermicro, the ODMs, I think we have all the right platforms. It just takes a bit more time for them to complete their evaluations.
How do you see average selling prices for RAM trending relative to Naples going forward?
Yeah, so we do see, so the way we think about this is, look, we want to provide value to the data center operator, and at the end of the day, there needs to be something in it for everyone, right? It is work to switch from our competitor to AMD. There's work to be done, there's optimization to be done, and so we believe we're pricing at, let's call it excellent performance at a fair price. And as it relates to from our standpoint, because the technology capability is going up, we do expect ASPs for us to increase as we go from Naples to Rome as well, and that should reflect in our forward-looking financials.
AMD has, over the last couple of years, talked up its efforts to offer a lot of the features that Intel has traditionally reserved for dual-socket servers on single-socket servers, and it seems with RAM you're doubling down on that. Is there an estimate you can give for how much of AMD's second-gen EPYC revenue could potentially involve single-socket servers relative to dual-socket servers? And are there particular types of customers that you feel are especially interested in them?
Yeah, so we do feel strongly about this. We do feel strongly about this idea that customers should be able to decide whether they want, all processor performance or they want, sort of the balance between processor and I/O. I think single-socket is still new to many in the industry, and so we see more interest, but I would say it's still one of those areas where people have to get used to it. So I don't have an exact percentage today. I would say I expect it to grow as we go into second generation EPYC compared to the first generation. But the other thing about Rome is the dual socket performance is just incredible as well, and so we think both single socket and dual socket will do well.
AMD has talked about achieving a double-digit server CPU share within 4 to 6 quarters of achieving a mid-single-digit share, which you believe you achieved that by the end of 2018. Given how diverse the server CPU market is, all the different types of customers and workloads there are there particular market segments where you feel like AMD might be able to achieve, say, a 15% market share, in relative near future?
Yeah, so as it relates to market share targets, I think we are, we feel well positioned to, achieve those targets that we previously talked about. That would put, sort of the double-digit mark somewhere between sort of end of this year, middle of next year. And a lot of work has to happen for that, but we feel good about that. As it relates to, look, what I say is, look, 10% share is not a destination, right? It's a point in time. And there are segments where we think our market share will be substantially higher than that. We certainly think in HPC, the value proposition is very, very strong, and we see that with both sort of all of sort of the HPC providers. And we think in cloud, our value proposition is very, very strong. And frankly, I think in enterprise, it's also quite strong. So it's really a matter of sort of time to market and time to ramp. And as I said earlier, I think cloud and HPC move a little bit faster than traditional enterprise.
Yeah, Rome will be launched in about 2 years after AMD launched Naples. At the same time, AMD has indicated its next-gen EPYC platform, codenamed Milan, will be available around mid-2020. And Intel, for its part, has suggested it wants to launch new server CPU platforms once every 4 to 5 quarters. Does AMD have a target going forward regarding how frequently it wants to launch new server CPU platforms?
I think we aim to be competitive. So if I put that stake in the ground, I think whether it's 4 or 5 or 6 quarters, it's in that range. But we aim to be very competitive.
It's early right now, but are there any details AMD can share about Milan's expected performance gains relative to Rome? Any what the potential improvements could be in instructions per clock, or in what particular areas AMD especially wants to build on Rome's advances?
Well, I think it's a little early to talk about details of Milan. What I will say is that our Zen 3 core design is complete. We like how it looks. We have plenty of ideas. Our engineers have plenty of ideas populating Zen 3 and Zen 4 based on some of our learnings off of Naples and Rome. And so, we'll continue to push the envelope. But, we'll talk more about it as we get closer to those products.
I wanted to ask us about graphics-intensive workloads, in particular, things like cloud gaming, virtual desktops. AMD has had some traction there. And obviously, AMD has, a large GPU business. Is AMD interested in potentially developing server CPUs with integrated GPUs?
Yeah, great question. Look, first of all, I think the market around, we love all things gaming. So when you think about gaming, you think about, PC gaming, console gaming, cloud gaming. They all need very powerful graphics as well as processor capability. As it relates to cloud gaming in particular, we have had some success with Google and their Stadia launch. I think we're engaged across the industry. I wouldn't count anything out. In terms, we already have integrated graphics on our PC processors. In server, it's not so much whether it's integrated on the same chip that's important. What's really important is the connectivity between CPUs and GPUs. And so we're very focused on our Infinity architecture and how do we ensure that connectivity is as efficient as it can possibly be.
Earlier this year, AMD announced a deal with Cray to supply CPUs and GPUs for the Department of Energy's Frontier supercomputer. And I thought it was interesting, that the supercomputer will feature nodes that contain one custom AMD CPU that's connected to 4 GPUs through the Infinity Fabric. Is AMD open to offering something like that on an off-the-shelf basis rather than just on a custom basis?
Yeah, so great point. So we're extremely proud of the Frontier design win. I think it's one of those, really big, tough problems that you have to put your best innovation together to make it happen. And it is a customized, CPU and some custom GPU efforts for Frontier to get to the, over 1.5 exaflops. I do think, though, you're going to see many of those technologies come into standard products. As we go forward, our goal is to push the envelope in HPC, and so for general purpose HPC applications, you'll see some of those technologies come into play.
I wanted to ask about AMD's thoughts about Taiwan Semi's 5 nanometer manufacturing process. I know you mentioned Milan will use a 7 nanometer plus process, but TSMC will be starting volume production for the 5nm process in the first half of 2020. How is AMD broadly thinking about adopting 5 nanometer? For example, would it be a node that I would first deploy for like PC CPUs or in GPUs rather than server CPUs?
Well, so we look at sort of technology intercepts very carefully. We want to be early, but not too early. You want to be make sure that you can do a volume ramp. We haven't talked in detail about our 5 nanometer plans just yet. I think TSMC is a great partner. We continue to work closely with them, and we'll talk more about our future technology plans later on.
I want to ask a little bit about AMD's plans for addressing the enterprise market. Like NVIDIA's entered the hardware space with their DGX supercomputers. They've created their own systems. Given that AMD is has both server CPUs and GPUs, would it be open to launching its own hardware systems, or would it prefer to just work with OEM partners?
We work really closely with OEM and ODM partners, and that has been our go-to-market strategy. I think it's the right strategy. We believe in this idea of an open ecosystem, so you get the best of the best. And we continue to work on how do we specify those systems so they take the best advantage of our hardware.
AMD's willingness to support next-gen memory technologies, like Intel's talked up its support for its Optane next-gen memory, which relies on 3D XPoint. And that 3D XPoint was co-developed with Micron, which plans to launch its own XPoint product soon. Is AMD open to partnering with a company like Micron to support next-gen memory?
Yeah, so we are opening to partnering across the ecosystem. So especially in memory, it's so important to bring memory closer to the CPU, and we know that. That's one of the key things. We have a great partnership with Micron, Samsung, as well as Hynix, and we think pushing the envelope on that connection between CPU and memory is very important going forward.
Would AMD be open to supporting something like AVX 512 going forward?
Well, so we did a tremendous amount of work around the floating point in Zen 2. So we actually, sort of doubled our floating point capability. And then once you look at the number of cores we've actually, the Rome architecture compared to Naples is about 4 times the floating point. We're always going to look at how we keep pushing on floating point, and that, again, that's one of the mantras of leadership.
I wanted to ask about AMD's partnership with Xilinx. You've been partnering with them for a while. Companies have a common competitor, Intel. Could you talk a little bit about how you see that partnership potentially evolving, and what types of workloads and customers you frequently see using both AMD's CPUs and Xilinx's FPGAs?
Yeah, so we are pleased with the partnership with Xilinx. I think the teams are very technically engaged, and most importantly, we want to make sure that the interoperability. We're both pushing the edge on the interconnect, and so on PCI Gen 4 and all of these things, we're very well aligned. In terms of early applications, certainly there are some cloud environments that are looking at CPU plus FPGA environments, and so we have some joint engagements in that area. Thinking about how some of these edge computing applications move forward. We have some engagements in those areas as well.
Given that AMD's resources have been growing, is investing more in software developers and in just building out your engagements with third-party developers an area of interest for the company?
Totally. If you look at where we're adding resources, we're just adding a ton of resources in software, and that software across, let's call it, the basic, sort of driver stack, which is really important for enablement, as well as software on libraries and also some of the machine learning frameworks, ensuring that TensorFlow runs well, PyTorch, MXNet, these guys. So I think in our business, the software is just so important to really enable the hardware.
I wanted to ask also about ROM's Chinese adoption. AMD mentioned during last week's earnings call that trade and tariff uncertainties in the U.S. entities list are affecting its sales a little bit. And How do you see Rome's adoption within the Chinese market trending over the next few quarters?
Yeah, so look, certainly we're all very cognizant of what's going on between the U.S. and China and some of the tensions. There are several of our customers that are on the entities list, and we are not shipping to those customers. That being said, there's a broad market in China. I think Rome is extraordinarily competitive, whether, again, you're talking about sort of cloud environments in the US or cloud environments in China, as well as enterprise environments. And so we think Rome is going to do well.
Then wanted to ask for a second about like interconnect technologies. AMD's supported a few different ones. You supported C6, supported OpenCAPI, and then more recently supported CXL, which was originally started by Intel. What's AMD's views on how these technologies will be adopted going forward and how they'll coexist?
Well, we feel really it's really important to ensure that the interconnect is open, so truly open, and that means no competitor has an advantage in any particular way. That being the case, we are as you mentioned, fairly open across standards, and we continue to listen to sort of our customers and what they want, and what they want is to be able to connect the best CPU to the best accelerator, and so that requires us to adopt a few technologies.
Your server CPU sales are grouped within the enterprise embedded and semi-custom segment, which also covers AMD's game console processor sales. Given how the server CPU business has been growing, is AMD open to separately breaking out its sales or potentially putting them in a new reporting segment that also covers server GPU sales?
Yeah, so we believe our segment reporting is the best way to do it right now for the company. We do try to provide additional color. I know there's a lot of interest around the data center. I still consider ourselves very, very early in the adoption cycle for data center in both CPUs and GPUs. And so we'll constantly look at this as we go forward, but we think these are the right reporting segments with the notion of we will give additional color to try to help the investment community.
All right. AMD hasn't historically bought many companies, but its resources are growing. You could potentially finance a larger acquisition if you wanted to, either with cash or stock. How does AMD feel about potentially using M&A to strengthen its data center position and offer more platform level solutions there?
Yeah, so I think that it is definitely something that we look at and think about. We've done some smaller scale M&A to acquire mostly skills in recent years, and those aren't things that we talk in a big way about. And I think as we go forward, as the balance sheet strengthens, as the revenue grows, as we have more capability, we'll certainly look at M&A as a way to accelerate the business.
All right. And my last question was about your future plans. Earlier this week, you strongly denied a rumor about leaving for IBM, and you've been AMD CEO for almost 5 years now. I guess my question would be, how long would you see yourself potentially staying at AMD? And are there particular long-term goals that you're looking to see through as AMD CEO?
Well, I can say for sure I'm staying at AMD. So look, one of the things that is really important to me is, look, we are still in the early innings of the AMD story. If you take a look at how long it takes for a tech company to really complete a full cycle, although I've been CEO for 5 years, we're just at the cusp of some incredibly competitive products. And I'd like to see us become one of the premier growth franchises in tech. And that means growing market share in servers and PCs and continuing to deepen our partnerships. So yeah, I have a lot to do.